Lie to Deep. Hello everyone, wishing you all good health and peace in life. That morning, the air inside the hospital felt unusually heavy, as if it too was holding its breath. No one expected CEO James to make such a bold, shocking decision in front of the entire medical board. His voice was steady, but his eyes carried a storm of pain and resolve. It wasn't just a choice, it was a declaration, one that would change everything. But what truly shook everyone to their core was not just James's decision. It was the reason behind it. A hidden truth had resurfaced, a truth about Tu Diep's biological mother. Why had she abandoned her? Why now, after all these years, had she returned, not with love, but with secrets that threatened to destroy the fragile peace Tu Diep had finally begun to build? As James stood there, protecting the woman he loved more than his own life, the weight of betrayal, loss, and long-buried wounds filled the sterile hallways. What did Tu Diep's mother really want? And could James's heart endure another storm for the sake of the woman who had already lost too much? The hospital hallway was quiet, but tension hung thick in the air like fog before a storm. Nurses whispered behind the counter. Doctors exchanged glances. No one dared to say it out loud, but everyone was thinking the same thing: why did he do it? Inside room 402, James stood near the window, his hands clenched into fists. His gaze was far away, fixed on something beyond the glass. The city skyline shimmered in the distance, but his mind was locked in the past 24 hours ago, before everything collapsed. Tu Diep lay on the hospital bed, pale and fragile, her breathing shallow. Machines beeped rhythmically beside her, like a cold reminder that time was ticking, that her body was still here even if her soul seemed to be drifting. James had made a decision that no one expected. Not the doctors, not the board, not even Tu Diep's own family. He had signed over the legal authority for her treatment, not to her foster parents, not to himself, but to the very woman who had abandoned her at birth, her biological mother. Lan. The moment the ink dried, chaos followed. Lan had returned like a storm, sudden and uninvited. When she first came to the hospital, most believed she was just another grieving stranger. No one expected her to show up with documents, medical history, and a confession that would change everything. I am her mother. I gave her away, and now I want to save her. The doctors hesitated. The legal department scrambled. James watched the woman with eyes full of suspicion, pain, and something deeper: fear. Tu Diep had just begun to recover from the emotional shock of seeing her mother for the first time in decades. Now, that same woman was asking for the right to decide her fate. Everyone begged James to say no, but he didn't. Later that evening, Lan stepped quietly into the room. Her hands trembled as she sat by her daughter's side. She opened a small notebook yellowed with time and began to read softly. It was filled with poems she had written during her pregnancy. She had kept them all these years, locked away in a wooden box, along with regret, silence, and shame. As the words fell into the air, something stirred in Tu Diep's face. Her eyes fluttered. A tear slid down her cheek. "She hears you," James whispered from the corner. Len looked at him. "I don't deserve to." "It's not about deserving," he replied. "It's about showing up. You left her once. Don't do it again." Lan wiped her eyes. "I won't." In the hallway, the nurses watched in stunned silence as James closed the door behind them. The man who had every reason to hate had chosen to forgive, and the woman everyone blamed had returned not to justify her choices, but to stand beside the girl she had once let go. The hospital would talk for days, but James didn't need anyone's approval. The night stretched on, heavy with silence. Rain tapped gently against the hospital windows, as if the sky itself were mourning something unseen. Inside room 402, the soft rhythm of Tu Diep's breathing was the only sign of life. James sat at the edge of the bed, his fingers gently wrapped around hers, as if holding on could anchor her to this world. Lan hadn't left the room since James made the decision. She moved slowly, carefully, as if afraid that any sudden motion might scare her daughter away again. Every so often, she whispered little fragments from her memory, the way Tu Diep used to kick during her last trimester, the first lullaby she ever sang, the scent of the tiny blanket she once folded and left behind. James listened, saying little. He didn't trust her yet, not fully, but there was something honest in the way her voice cracked when she spoke Tu Diep's name. Something human, something that reminded him they were both just people trying to mend a past too painful to carry. Alone, as dawn broke, Tu Diep stirred. It wasn't much a flutter of her eyelashes, a quiet shift in her chest, but James shot up instantly. Lan gasped, tears leaping into her eyes. "Diep." James leaned close, his voice hoarse with hope. "Can you hear me?" Her lips moved slowly, a breath, a whisper. "James," he exhaled sharply, like he'd been holding it in for days. "I'm here." Her eyes opened, confused and glassy. They darted around the room and landed on Lan. There was a long pause. Lan stood frozen. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She looked like a woman afraid her very presence might shatter the moment. Tu Diep stared at her. Her mouth parted. "You." Lan's hands trembled. "Yes, Dad, it's me. I'm your mother." Tu Diep didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just lay there in silence, processing the impossible truth. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then, Tu Diep turned her face to the window. "Why now?" she asked softly. Lan stepped closer, her voice barely audible. "Because I was a coward. I waited too long. But I never stopped thinking about you. Not for a single day." Silence. James reached for Tu Diep's hand again. She didn't pull away, but she didn't squeeze back either. "You abandoned me," she said finally. "You let me grow up thinking I was unwanted." Lan's eyes filled. "I know, and nothing I say will ever make that right. But I want to be here now. Not to erase the past, just to be part of your present, if you let me." James watched Tu Diep's face. He saw the storm in her eyes, the struggle between pain and longing, anger and vulnerability. And then, slowly, he saw something else, exhaustion. Tu Diep closed her eyes. "I don't know if I can forgive you." "You don't have to," Lan whispered. "But I'll wait, as long as it takes." That night, James wheeled Tu Diep outside into the hospital garden. The sky had cleared. The flowers were still wet from the rain. She breathed in the scent of jasmine and soil and early sunlight. "She's not the only one who's scared," Tu Diep said quietly. "I know," James replied. "What if I let her in, and it breaks me again?" James turned to face her. "Then I'll be here to hold the pieces." And in that moment, Tu Diep didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Because healing doesn't always begin with a decision, it begins with presence, with someone staying long enough for the silence to feel safe again. Lan returned to the hospital every day after that. Sometimes she brought tea, sometimes she brought old photographs, sometimes she just sat silently beside the bed, waiting, and slowly, Tu Diep stopped turning away when she entered the room. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic forgiveness, just small moments, a question, a glance, a shared memory of music boxes and lullabies. And from those pieces, something began to grow. Not what had been lost, but something new, something real. Weeks passed. The sterile walls of the hospital slowly became familiar. Tu Diep was recovering, but the journey was slow physically, emotionally, and even spiritually. Her body was healing, but her heart was tangled in the past, unsure of how to trust again, unsure of who to let in. James remained by her side like a lighthouse in the fog, steady, patient, quietly hopeful. He didn't push her. He didn't ask her to forgive. He simply stayed. Every morning, he brought her warm porridge from the little shop downstairs, and every evening, he read her short stories until she fell asleep. Lan came too, often at the edge of visiting hours. She no longer cried as much. Instead, she brought soft blankets, fresh fruit, and sometimes even lullabies that she used to sing to herself during the years Tu Diep was gone. The bond between them was fragile, but it was beginning to breathe. One afternoon, as golden sunlight filtered through the hospital blinds, Tu Diep turned to her mother and asked quietly, "Why did you leave me?" Lan looked at her with eyes heavy from years of silence. "Because I thought I wasn't enough. I was young, scared and alone. Your father, he didn't stay. And I didn't believe I could give you the life you deserved." Tu Diep swallowed, the words pressing against the lump in her throat. "You could have tried." "I know." Len lowered her head. "And I regret not fighting harder." Every single day, the room was quiet again. Then Tu Diep said, "Do you still have that poem you read me?" Len reached into her bag, pulled out the old notebook, and handed it to her daughter. Tu Diep ran her fingers across the faded cover. The scent of old paper, ink, and something tender wafted into her chest like a forgotten memory. She opened it and began to read. He nodded gently. "She wrote it the day you first opened your eyes after the accident." Tu Diep leaned back into her pillows. The rain began again, tapping gently on the glass, this time not as a storm, but as a gentle rhythm, like the soft beating of a heart. Later that night, when James was alone with Tu Diep in the quiet glow of the bedside lamp, she looked at him, her voice softer than ever. "You did something no one else would have done. You let her back in." He reached for her hand. "Because I know how much it hurts to have someone disappear without answers. You deserved those answers, even if they were painful." She blinked back tears. "You're not just the man who stayed. You're the man who understood." James smiled, though his eyes were wet. "Then maybe, one day, you'll let me be more." Tu Diep didn't answer, but she didn't let go of his hand either. And for James, that was enough. The hospital still whispered with rumors. Some doctors still questioned James' decision, but none of them saw what he saw: Tu Diep slowly becoming whole again. Not because someone fixed her, but because she was finally allowed to heal. As the days passed, she learned that love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's broken, and sometimes it comes back in a form you never expected, asking not for a second chance, but simply for the courage to stand beside you. And slowly, gently, Tu Diep began to say yes. In life, pain often arrives in the quietest moments, through forgotten memories, unanswered questions, or the face of someone who once left without a word. But healing, too, comes gently, not in grand gestures or sudden forgiveness, but in the patient decision to keep breathing, to keep hoping, and to let time soften the edges of our wounds. From Tu Diep's story, we learn that forgiveness is not about forgetting the past, it is about finding peace with it. It's the strength to look someone in the eye who once broke you and say, "I am still standing." Sometimes, people leave because they are broken themselves. Sometimes, they return because they finally have the courage to face what they ran from. James teaches us another kind of love, the kind that stays when things are hard, the kind that doesn't need words to prove itself. True love is quiet. It's presence, it's patience, it's understanding without judgment. It's giving someone space to heal while holding their hand when they're ready. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all, we don't always get to choose the family we're born into, but we can choose how we respond when truth is revealed. We can choose love over bitterness, forgiveness over resentment, and connection over silence, because at the end of the day, healing doesn't mean the past didn't happen. It means it no longer controls your future. Healing, like love, is not a straight line. It stumbles, it hesitates. Some days, Tu Diep felt strong, ready to face the world. Other days, the weight of her mother's absence crushed her all over again. But every time she stood back up, even shakily, she reclaimed a little more of herself. This is what resilience looks like. Not perfection, not smiles all the time, but the courage to keep choosing life, to keep choosing love even after it disappointed you. Through Tu Diep's journey, we learn that true strength is not in holding back tears, but in allowing them to fall and still, believing in tomorrow,